In this video, I'm going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to do a debate with artificial intelligence, with Grok, asking it some questions about the Book of Mormon, in particular in this one, a piece of evidence known as the Back Creek Stone. And we'll see what Grok says, and then sort of have a debate with Grok. What this will allow us to do is kind of see what the mainstream science and response would be to the evidence I've given before about the Bat Creek Stone. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bat Creek Stone, I've said before that the Bat Creek Stone is the best authenticated artifact with Hebrew writing in ancient North America. It was found by the Smithsonian in the 1800s. It was assumed to be authentic and kept by and displayed by the Smithsonian for decades until they realized that the writing on it was paleo-Hebrew. Once they realized it was paleo-Hebrew, they removed it from the shelves and have maintained that it is a forgery, that it must have been forged. There's a lot of things about the Bat Creek Stone that point to its authenticity. First of all, that it was found by the Smithsonian in a dig that was assumed to be authentic. It was found by individuals who were actually opposed and hostile to the idea of Native Americans being related to the Hebrews, so there was no motivation there for it. It wasn't recognized or published or sought for fame or fortune as a Hebrew artifact, so there was no indication of any motivation for money or fame in the finding of the stone. The finding of the stone was well documented, found in a Native American mound that dates to the Book of Mormon timeframes in the early, right around 100 BC to 400 AD, a mound that fits to that time frame. There was carbon dating of artifacts found with the stone that date to the Book of Mormon time frame. And so it's really an interesting artifact. I think it's the best authenticated artifact showing Hebrew writing in the ancient Americas. And I've done videos in the past talking about the evidence for and against and why I think it's authentic. In this video, in talking with Grok, what you'll see is that artificial intelligence basically operates sort of polling. It will always give you essentially the mainstream science version. It will basically always give you that version, and it's sort of like having a debate with a smart mainstream science individual who has all of the information quickly at its fingertips. And so let's go ahead and have that conversation. I think in doing that, you'll learn a great deal more about the Bat Creek Stone, and you'll be also more prepared in looking at all of the arguments for and against it. So first, if you're interested in the prior video that I did about the Bat Creek Stone, you can find it on my channel. I called it The Best Evidence of Hebrew Writing in Ancient America. And anyway, you could find it there. And taking a look at the Bat Creek Stone, let me just show you. So as you can see that from the Smithsonian website, they call it the Bat Creek Tablet. It's usually called the Bat Creek Stone. They talk about how it was found actually it was found in 1889. But it shows it entered in there, and it has the specimen number. This is what it looks like. So just you can so you can see it's a reddish brown sandstone with engraved writing on it. This shows the writing in right side up. It was displayed upside down in the Smithsonian for decades. They thought it was random marks or perhaps a form of a Paleo Cherokee. And when it was seen by an individual identified and as Paleo Hebrew right around the 1970 time frame, the Smithsonian then pulled it from their shelves and said that it must be a forgery and so forth. But there's a little bit of debate about what it says. Most translate it to something to the effect of to or for the Judeans, are for the people of God there. And then there are a couple of marks that some of these are clear paleo-Hebrew marks, and it has a couple of marks that are more disputed as to what they may mean because they're not paleo-Hebrew. But in my prior video, I go into the details of that. So let's go to Grok. So if you're interested in interacting with artificial intelligence, the Grok, you can grok.com. This is the one that's done by X, Elon Musk's company. You can just go to the site. You can type in. Also, you can access it via the old Twitter through X. But if you can just type in, for example, say here, I like to say in 200 words or less or something like that because Grok can be very long-winded in its answers otherwise, which won't work very well for here. But in 200 words or less, I'll just ask, is the Bat Creek stone authentic? And what we'll do is we'll take a look at their answers, and then I'll do follow-up questions. And I expect that what you'll see is that it'll give you the Main Street answer. It'll say that it's not authentic. Again, I don't know exactly what the results will be of this interaction, but it'll say that it's not authentic because that's the mainstream view. And then it'll give its reasons, and I'll ask about additional evidence, and we'll just see where it takes us. Okay, so it gives us the response. Okay, it says, the Bat Creek stone, discovered in 1889 in Tennessee, is controversial. Initially identified as Cherokee by Cyrus Thomas, it was later proposed by Cyrus Gordon in the 1970s to bear paleo-Hebrew inscriptions suggesting ancient Judean presence. Supporters cite the radiocarbon dating and petrographic analysis indicating centuries of weathering consistent with the mound's context. So far, all of this is true. Discovered in 1889 in Tennessee, Loudoun County, Tennessee at the time. It's at the Bat Creek Creek and the mound there. The mounds fit the Book of Mormon time frame. There was, with the Bat Creek stone, some polished wood that were polished wood that appeared to have been like ear spools, sort of like earrings, but ear spools worn by the Native American that was buried, or at least were buried with a Native American skeleton. When those were dated, it dated to 427 AD, but with a wide range, so somewhere between 32 AD to 769 AD. Given that, with the context of the mounds that would have been built in that up to about 400 or so AD time frame, what it does is it says basically somewhere between 32 AD and 400 some AD. And then there's also, as it says, been petrographic analysis of the rock, which shows weathering, which would indicate an old context. But then it goes to the opposite. So skeptics, including Robert Mainford and Mary Quass, who are professors. Let me just show you who they are. This here, Robert Mainford and Mary Quass. Robert Mainford is a professor, anthropologist, archaeologist, and Mary Quass was a research assistant. And they're some of the main ones who've written articles about the Bat Creek stone. Okay, so back to the Grok's argument. So skeptics, including Mainford and Quass, say that it's a forgery. Their evidence is they point to similarities with a Masonic book that has Hebrew writing similar to what's on the Bat Creek stone. And then they have questions about John Emmert, who was the field assistant for the Smithsonian and found it. They say that Emmert has a dubious record and they accuse him of being the likely forger. In addition, it says there are brass bracelets found with the Bat Creek stone that they identified as modern trade goods. Now here, this is something that will be in dispute, and I'll ask Grok about, because at first the bracelets were identified in the Smithsonian as being copper. They're later, after they said that it was discovered to have Hebrew, they said that they went back and they looked at the bracelets. They said it's actually brass, which is a copper zinc combination. And they said that it fits modern trade goods. Now, what we'll talk about is actually the composition there of the copper and the zinc is something that is not necessarily modern. It was used anciently, for example, in the Old World back to Roman times, for example, you'll see the same composition of the brass. It says most scholars lean toward fraud. Well, that's true. Noting paleographic inconsistencies. I don't know what they're talking about there, but we'll ask about it. Indigenous perspectives, Cherokee scholars find no cultural link. That's essentially irrelevant about a cultural link. But anyway, and then it talks about Scott Wolter, who defend its authenticity, but it says the consensus is against it due to lack of corroborating evidence and historical context. And then it says doubtful without further proof. Okay, so then let's ask a follow-up question. Okay, so in this response, there are a couple of things that I'd like to follow up with. The first of them is this part where it says that the brass bracelets, so that their main, Grok's main points, he says the brass bracelets were identified as modern trade goods. We'll ask more about that and contest that point. Then it says there's also paleographic inconsistencies. We'll have to come back to that as a second question. Then it also says that it needs additional proof that it'll doubt the stone's authenticity without further proof. So we'll give it some further evidence and see how it responds to that. So there are three lines of questions. One, asking about the modern trade goods identification, whether that's real or true. Second, asking about the paleographic inconsistency, see what it means about that and whether that's true. And then we'll give it some additional proof and see how it reacts to that. Okay, so first we'll type in you said that the brass bracelets were identified as modern trade goods. Let's say in 200 words or less. Because again, Grok can otherwise give you really long answers. What is the evidence for that conclusion? And we'll see how it responds. Okay. The brass bracelets found with the Bat Creek stone were identified as modern trade goods based on several lines of evidence. Metallurgical analysis, detailed in a 1988 study by Robert Mainford and Mary Quass, revealed the bracelets were made of brass with a composition typical of 19th century European or American manufacture, not ancient Near Eastern alloys. The bracelets' rolled and hammered construction matched techniques used in trade goods supplied to Native Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Historical records confirm brass ornaments were common in trade networks. Additionally, the bracelet's context within the mound raised suspicions due to his questionable credibility and lack of detailed documentation. No comparable ancient Judean artifacts have been found in the region, and the bracelet style aligns with post-contact trade items rather than pre-Columbian technology. These factors strongly suggest the bracelets were modern, supporting the view that the Bat Creek stone assemblage is likely a 19th century fabrication. Okay, so there are a couple of things to follow up here. One is they say that metallurgical analysis detailed in a study by Mainford and Quast. Now, I know from my research that Mainford and Quast did not actually do any metallurgical study of the stone themselves. Mainford is just an anthropologist, archaeologist. He has no experience in doing metallurgical analysis. Mary Quast is just his research assistant. The study that they're talking to is that there is a statement by the Smithsonian in 1971 that said that the bracelets were a composition typical of 19th century European or American manufacture. However, in an article by Mainford and Quast themselves, they admit that that composition was also known anciently. So it's not necessarily something that was done more recent. It is something that was done anciently. And then the rolled and hammered construction is actually a more ancient technique, not a modern technique. So we'll need to follow up with those two things. So in terms of the rolled and hammered, the modern technique is for making bracelets would be to use a wire or to do casting. what these bracelets that were found with a Back Creek stone, they were hollow inside. They were not formed by wire, and they were not cast. So it's not a typical modern construction. Instead, it has seams that shows that the brass was rolled and hammered, which is more of an ancient construction. Now, there have been that can be done in modern times or in ancient times, but my point is that actually is not evidence for it being modern construction, and we'll have to dig into that. Okay, and then it just goes back to questions about Emmert, questionable credibility, and that part is unfair and untrue. We'll have to address that separately as well, and then. Um, And then it says there aren't comparable ancient Judean artifacts. That's untrue as well. So in my prior video, there are comparable ancient Judean artifacts that have been found. Same type of construction, same type of shape. Just the ones that have been found so far were made of bronze, not brass. So if you just did it in brass instead of bronze, there have been already found ancient Judean artifacts that do fit that. Okay, so let's follow up. So I put in the follow-up question that it just said that the bracelets were modern manufacture because of the metal composition of the bracelets and the way that they were constructed fits 18th, 19th century trade goods. But I'm going to specifically ask it, well, isn't it true that Mainford and Quas, who are the people it's relying on, acknowledged that the metal composition was also used anciently, for example, by the Romans, and that the rolled and hammered technique for manufacturing the bracelets was actually done anciently, while modern bracelets from the 18th and 19th century instead more often from wire or by casting. So let's see what it says. Okay, so it says, yes, Mainford and Quas did acknowledge that the brass composition of the Back Creek stone, copper with zinc, does resemble alloys used anciently. So what you see here is that Grok, like artificial intelligence, it will use kind of the mainstream science and mainstream arguments, but you can't just take what it says as true. It can be misleading. So, and when you do the follow-up questions here, what you find is that while it just told you that the metal composition shows that it was 18th or 19th century, when you follow up with that, it acknowledges, okay, yeah, it's true, it was used anciently. And so those alloys are not exclusive to modern times. But then it says they also emphasize that the rolling and hammering matches 19th century trade goods common in Native American contexts. That's not really true. They argue that rolling and hammering is found in Native American contexts, but what if you go and look at it, and J. Houston McCullough has done a response on this. I'll show you who Professor McCullough is. J. Houston McCullough is a professor from Ohio State, and he has looked at the Back Creek stone, and in particular, he looked at some of the things that Mainford and Quast pointed to, and all of them except for one of them were not actually a rolling and hammering technique. It was being cut from wire. And then Grok goes on to admit that yes, anciently they did roll and hammer it. So again, the evidence that it points to, when you follow up, it basically admits that, okay, yeah, that's not evidence. The metal composition actually doesn't show that it was 18th and 19th century because it was used anciently. The rolling and hammering technique, which it said was 18th and 19th century, when you follow up, it's actually was done anciently as well. Ancient bracelets sometimes rolled and hammered. And that they were, and it is true, like I said, it acknowledges that it says that Mainford and Quas say that 18th and 19th century trade bracelets were typically made, rolled, and hammered, not from wire or casting. Well, that is incorrect. Like I said before, Mainford and Quas, Mainford's an anthropologist, not known for metal knowledge. And if that's been in separate things, we'll have to follow up. But For example, as McCullough has pointed out, 18th and 19th century, the normal way of making it would be the inexpensive, fast way of making a bracelet would be from drawing with making it from wire or casting it, not rolling it and hammering it as it would have been done anciently. Okay, and then it finishes up just that the debate persists. Okay, so let's pick back up and I'll do a follow-up question here asking, isn't it true that there were rolled C-shaped bracelets from ancient Israel that are a lot like and similar to what was found with the Bat Creek stone from ancient Israel that were just the only difference being that they're made from bronze instead of brass. And we'll see how it responds. Okay, and I forgot to limit it to 200 words or less, so you can get some really long answers. But basically, it says, yes, some people do say that there were rolled C-shaped bronze bracelets in ancient Israel, similar to the brass ones found with the Bat Creek stone. But then it talks about why it doesn't buy it. It does, but it essentially admits that what I said is correct. So it says that there were rolled C-shaped bracelets, often made of bronze, used in ancient Israel and the broader Near East from about 1200 BC to about 600 BC, which of course fits the Book of Mormon. And so that is the type of bracelet that was found with the Bat Creek stone. But it says, but that wasn't, it's not just ancient Israel that did this. It's not unique to that. And there have been some done later since that, including in 18th, 19th century. Yes, that's true. But it shows that the evidence it was relying on is essentially undermined because the only difference from what is already acknowledged is that these bracelets that were found with the Bat Creek stone are exactly like what was found in ancient Israel, 1200 BC to 600 BC, with the only difference that the copper was made into bronze instead of into brass. But we know that brass existed. For example, from the Book of Mormon, we know that the brass plates, they were using brass at the time, and there is acknowledgement that they used brass anciently. For example, in ancient Egypt, they used brass as well. So there's no reason why they couldn't make them into brass instead of bronze if they wanted the more golden look that you get with brass. Okay, and then it confirms that the bracelets were brass. It says it's composition consistent with modern trade goods, not ancient Near Eastern bronze. Well, it's true, but it is consistent with ancient Near Eastern brass. And that would be a separate question, but it's art that's addressed separately. Okay, and then it talks about the archaeological context. And then it talks about consensus again, which you'll find with artificial intelligence. A lot of times it just goes back to consensus, back to consensus. And so you really start to realize it's really just a machine. It's not an independent thinker. It gives you what it finds from what its algorithm tells it are the reliable type mainstream evidence that'll give back to you. And so then it acknowledges what I said is true, which is that rolled C-shaped bronze bracelets existed in ancient Israel, but then it says it doesn't think that it's ancient. Okay, so then let's go to the next follow-up question. So then this is the follow-up question I give it. So isn't it true that brass of a similar copper zinc composition was used by ancient Egyptians or Romans, and that's similar to the brass composition of the bracelets found with the Bat Creek stone? Okay, and so then the answer again, I need to limit it to shorter answers because they get too wordy. But as you'll see, it acknowledges that what I said is true. Yes, brass with copper zinc compositions, similar to what's was with the Bat Creek stone bracelets, was used in ancient times, including by Egyptians and Romans. But then will still go back and insist that no, you have to go with a mainstream science on it. And it says um, that the connection to the Back Creekstone bracelets is weak. And then goes into, it says, well, they only used it a little bit. And then there's no other evidence of its use in North America and so forth. And again, that's the whole um, answer if you're interested in reading the whole thing there. Okay, so let's go to the next follow-up question. Okay, so then this is a follow-up question. So what we've seen so far is that uh, Grok admits each of the things that I've said have been true, which is that the bracelets are of a type that was found anciently. It points to the bracelets as the main evidence, saying that the bracelets were 18th to 19th century manufacture. It points to that as the main evidence for the Back Creek stone not being genuine. But acknowledges with answers to my question that what I've said is true, which is that bracelets are actually of a type that was found in the ancient Israel, just with brass, and they haven't found brass bracelets like it in ancient Israel yet, but they found bronze ones just like it, and they know that brass was used anciently in that area, including in ancient Egypt. They just haven't found brass bracelets together that match the Back Creek stone. So it's acknowledged that. Now flip to this additional question, which is that, okay, so I ask it, all right, so if the mound that the Back Creek stone was found in, it was described by the Smithsonian when it was dug into in the 1800s as being undisturbed with an homogeneous clay composition. It had a tree above it. The roots from the tree went all the way down to the skeletons. So an undisturbed mound. And there was the skeleton. Under the skeleton's head was the bracelets together with polished wood that were used for ear spools for the skeleton. And so I say, well, then how do you propose that the bracelets were put in the mound under the skeleton's head if it was described as the mound being undisturbed and that the items found with the bracelets are indisputably ancient? And we'll see what it responds. Okay. And so what it says is, okay, yeah, that's a challenge. So it says, yeah, the Back Creek Stones mound was described as undisturbed with homogeneous clay and tree roots penetrating to the skeleton. So it acknowledges again what I've said is true. And it acknowledges that that's a challenge to its theory. But then, like we'll find with it keeps going back to the mainstream line of thinking, which it says still won't accept it as ancient. It acknowledges that the wood is carbon dated as ancient. They said that the carbon dating may be wrong. They say it's problematic due to potential contamination and old wood effects. So basically, what it's choosing to do is, well, you're right. So we'll throw out the whole carbon dating thing to stick with the mainstream view that it's a fraud. So they're willing to completely throw out the carbon dating thing, which, by the way, matches the timing of the type of mound that it was found in, etc. And it said, well, maybe it's contamination. And uh, and then they say John Emmert likely introduced the bracelets, possibly by digging and refilling the mound to place them under a skeleton's head. But we said, it was described as undisturbed mound. So basically, they're saying that Emmert's a complete liar, stuck the bracelets in, refilled it to defraud everyone. And that the undisturbed claim relies on Emmert's report, but then they say, well, we don't believe Emmert. So it's like, well, throw out the carbon dating, we'll throw out the testimony of the person that found it, even though he worked for the Smithsonian. He had no reason to lie. That's a separate video that goes into how he himself did not believe that the Native Americans were descended from the Jews. He never sought fame or fortune from the find. He didn't ever try to make a big deal out of the find. None of that was consistent with him doing such a big fraud. But nevertheless, that's what it goes back to. And then it goes back to saying that, again, the bracelets were modern trade goods. And so it was likely planted, even though it was described as being an undisturbed appearance. And so it says it just must have been really careful refilling, not ancient deposition. So it ignores basically the whole testimony of the roots going down, an undisturbed mound, all that kind of stuff. So let's do a follow-up question. And so this is the follow-up question I have for Grok on this. So the bracelets were found with the wood fragments under the skeleton. I say, but the polished wood fragments that were found with the bracelets were not only carbon dated as ancient, but they were also described as colored green from the long-term contact with the copper in the bracelets, meaning that the wood had to have been there next to the bracelets for a long time to cause that coloring staining of the wood. And so that would mean that it couldn't have been inserted by Emmert at the time of digging. If he inserted the bracelets at the time of digging, then you wouldn't have had them discoloring the wood next to it. And so I say, doesn't the green coloring of the wood show that the bracelets are also old? And the parts that I'm relying on for this comes from the 1890s official report from the Smithsonian from the digging, which I've sort of highlighted here. So this is a quote from Cyrus's, the official Smithsonian dig back in the 1890s when they did a report on it. So again, it's talking about the Back Creek Mound that it was found in, talks about the trees that were on it, and talks about how the roots of the trees ran down to the skeletons. It talks about all the skeletons were badly decayed. It says that there were, and it talks about what was discovered there, including the stone. And then it says that the earth around the skeleton was wet and the pieces of wood soft and colored green by contact with the copper bracelet. So this is what I'm referring to. And then it talks about how the bracelets, not only that, but it had been rolled in something that crumbled away when they are taken out. So, I mean, clearly the bracelets were there anciently. It wasn't something that Emmert just inserted, because if he had just inserted the bracelets, you wouldn't have stuff around it crumbling away. You wouldn't have the wood next to it colored green. It's clear that the bracelets had been there a long time. So anyway, go back to Grok and see what it says on this. Okay. Okay, so what it says is, so the polished wood fragments near the Bat Creek stone bracelets were carbon dated to 32 to 769 AD. They did show green staining from copper oxidation, which is exactly what I said. That does suggest prolonged contact. He admits exactly what I said. But it's still, what you see with this AI, it keeps going back to the mainstream thought. No matter what you do, it just keeps going back to the mainstream thought, because it's a machine. It doesn't have its own independent thinking. It only pulls from the best source, from the sources that its algorithm tells it to rely on. So it just keeps going back to the same thing. So acknowledges that, okay, it does show prolonged contact between the woods and the bracelet, and yes, the wood is dated anciently. And so then it just throws out the carbon dating. So So it just throws out the carbon dating, and then it says, well, maybe the green staining can form relatively quickly, doesn't require centuries. Okay, but even if it doesn't require centuries, even if it's only a year, that's still longer. I mean, longer than what would be here, because we have Emmert going and doing digs all over the country. He's doing digs in West Virginia, other places all over. He only goes there to do these mounds. So it would have had to have been, if he were to be a forger, it would have had to have been done like right at the same time, or very close to when it's digging up, and it's not prolonged contact. So, and anyway, so what you see is that, warn your kids about AI, because you can't rely on it for telling the truth. It will use the sources that it finds, but it will always find a way. It will find a way to manipulate around to stick with the answer that it wants to give you. So it says he could have replaced the bracelets with pre-existing naturally stained wood during excavation and then refilled the mound to appear undisturbed. So it's concocting a whole theory now. Maybe he like pre-stained the wood to go in. And why would he even do that? I mean, the wood doesn't help him. So this is 1800s. There's at that time they don't even know about carbon dating. Carbon dating isn't invented till decades later. There's no point for him to put wood fragments in there so that decades later that could be tested. I mean, it's just ridiculous to think that he would stain wood that you couldn't even do carbon date testing at the time for, but as part of this fraud. It's getting more ridiculous and more ridiculous, the explanations that it relies on, but it keeps getting back to the same thing. Okay, let's follow up the next question. So we go back to the next follow-up question. So then let's go back to the petrographic evidence. Remember from the original question also talked about petrographic, which it means the studies about the rock itself, the evidence on the rock itself. You can look at weathering and rock types and that kind of thing. Scott Wolter is an individual who did a petrographic study of the Bat Creek stone, and he said with the Bat Creek stone, it's a sandstone type that is similar to products in that area. So it fits with having been made in that area. And then he looked at the engravings in the stone, found that there were significant weathering in those engravings, which indicated that the marks were made anciently. You can compare that on the stone because Emmert describes in when he found it that he did a probe with a shovel which hit the stone, and you can see that mark on the back of the Bat Creek stone, the mark that was made with the shovel. And so you can look at the mark made at the time of the excavation with a shovel versus the marks that were made where the inscriptions are. And as Walter showed, the evidence shows that the engravings are ancient and show significant weathering, whereas the marks made by Emmert's shovel do not. So I'll ask Grok here, doesn't that difference in the weathering from the engravings to the mark made in the stone by Emmert's shovel show that the engravings were made anciently? And we'll see how Grok responds. Okay, so let's take a look at how Grok answered that. So it says that yes, the petrographic analysis found that the engraving showed weathering, unlike the fresh shovel mark. Yes, that suggests age. And then again, like it keeps doing, it'll go back and say, but that doesn't prove, right? It doesn't prove that it's ancient. It says weathering can occur over decades, not requiring centuries. Yes, but again, if even if it were only decades different, that would eliminate the whole fraud theory because the whole fraud theory hinges on Emmert doing it at the time that it was dug up. So even if the weathering occurred in decades, not centuries, it would still undermine the forgery theory by Emmert. And then it then pivots, knowing that that's an issue. It pivots then to argue that the inscription uh, and arguing the other things about the credibility. Okay, so let's do a follow-up question. So here's the follow-up question for it. So again, it said that the weathering, well, maybe the weathering could have occurred in decades. Doesn't necessarily mean centuries. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's authentic as ancient Hebrew. But I ask it, well, but if the weathering, even if the weathering and the inscription could have occurred in decades instead of centuries, that still contradicts the theory that Emmert forged it, right? Because Emmert wasn't even doing Native American digs decades before the Bat Creek stone was found. We'll see how it responds. So, so it says, so now it pivots to more forgery by Emmert. Okay, so it says, okay, so now it says shows the weathering. This is argued to contradict the forgery theory. Emmert wasn't even doing Native American digs decades earlier. They say, well, this doesn't disprove forgery. Um, it says that, again, going back to, they argue that he copied the inscription from a Masonic book. There's other context issues. And then they say weathering could result from a short-term burial. They say that Emmert could have, and maybe not even requiring decades, that maybe Emmert used like deliberate aging techniques and used an already weathered stone. It's not about the weathering of the stone, it's the weathering of the engravings in the stone. Uh, and so you see that it's kind of gotten to a ridiculous place where it talks about maybe Emmert used like deliberate aging techniques. He could have made, but it's the weathering in the stone, in the engravings, not the stone itself. And then it just starts to pivot to other evidence arguing about the inscription and other things. So let's follow up with questions about the inscription. We kind of got to the end of the line here, seeing that it won't change its mind, but it acknowledges each of the points as a challenge. It just pivots to something else. Okay, so let's follow up with this next question. Okay, so this is a follow-up question for it. So again, it says that maybe Emmert copied the inscription. It says he may have copied an inscription and may have manipulated the inscription in the stone to make it look older. So my follow-up question to it is, you say that Emmert could have manipulated the engravings in the stone to make them look older in 200 words or less. What evidence do you have that Emmert in the 1800s knew how to weather the engravings in order to such that it could pass a 21st century petrography exam that uses microscopic techniques when that ability for microscopic investigation of stones didn't even exist back then? We'll see how Grok responds. Okay, so it admits there's no evidence that ever knew how to weather engravings. There's no evidence that it knew how to weather things to deceive microscopy. It wasn't developed back then. Um, and then it says, but the forgery didn't necessarily require advanced techniques. You could do simple methods like exposing the stone to moisture, soil, or chemicals. Again, it's thinking it's weathering the stone, but it's the weathering of the inscriptions within the stone. And exposing the stone to moisture, soil, or chemicals would not mimic the engravings in the stone. If you look back at Walter's microscopic examination, it's more about the weathering away of stuff in the engravings and then comparing that to the engravings made by the shovel. So all of this stuff about dipping the stone in, you would have to be doing working on one specific side, knowing not to do it on the other side. There's no evidence that Emmert was kind of the, mad genius scientist to do anything like that. He's just a field assistant for the Smithsonian. Okay, but anyway, it still refuses to give up. And then it says that Emmert, for job security, aimed to fool contemporary observers. And that's just bogus too. So Emmert, for job security, he had one boss. His boss was Cyrus Thomas. Cyrus Thomas was opposed to the idea of Native Americans being descendants of Hebrews. So if you wanted job security, the last thing you would do is come up with a Hebrew inscription. I mean, that would get you fired from your boss that hates the idea. If you want job security, you would not. You would do the exact opposite, and you would not create a Hebrew forgery. But let's go ahead and then go to the inscription because so here's the proposed response for additional questions. So it says you said that the inscription on the Bat Creek stone matches an inscription, a paleo-Hebrew typewriting that was found in an 1870 Masonic book, which would be sort of the source of proposed copying or forging that Emmert copied. Just because there's no evidence that Emmert knew any Hebrew or anything like that. So they said that he probably copied it out of this book, which had a Hebrew writing in it. So you said that the inscription matches an inscription in this Masonic book, but that isn't really true, is it? In 200 words or less, isn't it true that the Bat Creek stone has multiple additional or different marks or letters than what is found in the Paleo-Hebrew writing found in that book? We'll see how it responds. Okay, so it says it argues that, well, they say it closely resembles, and it says it's not an exact match. Um, and then they still think, it still says because it was close enough, they think it copied that the stone does have additional or slightly different marks. It says these are attributed to errors or embellishments by an inexpert forger instead of authenticity. And so it says that this researcher says that, yeah, the characters mimic Paleo-Hebrew but have mistakes that are inconsistent with genuine ancient script. Whereas proponents like Cyrus Gordon, who is a Hebrew scholar, claim the differences actually support a unique ancient inscription, meaning as Paleo-Hebrew writing, but with additional authentic ancient marks, showing a derivation or a change in the language from Paleo-Hebrew found in Egypt, as in Israel. It says, but this lacks corroborating archaeological evidence. Well, that's not true, but certainly in the accepted archaeology, there aren't other Hebrew writings. But in fact, there are a number of Hebrew artifacts with Hebrew writing on it, but they're just all considered forgeries by the mainstream. And then it goes back to the bracelets and the same type of arguments that I was doing before. So, and it goes back to the consensus. Again, AI will keep taking you back to the consensus. It's and that's one of the downfalls of AI is that it really only it's a machine that it's based off what you put in. If it's garbage in, it's garbage out. It's very quick at processing, but it's reliant on the sources that this algorithm tells it to trust. So anyway, let's do a follow-up question then about this, about the additional marks, which it says are errors and embellishments by an inexpert forger. So, and we'll ask because actually some of those marks look like they could be authentic, and we'll follow up with that. So here's the follow-up question response to the AI Grok. So again, it says there the additional marks on the stone that says are attributed to errors or embellishments by an inexpert forger. There's no evidence that Emmert was an expert in Hebrew. As a matter of fact, when he found the stone, he wrote that I've never seen any markings like these, and there's no evidence that he had any knowledge of ancient languages or of Hebrew. So I say to Grok, you indicate that the additional marks are errors or mistakes made by an inexpert forger. But isn't it true, for example, that the comma-like word divider or humble mark on the stone was not known to be authentic or ancient in the 1800s at the time it was found, but has since been found to be authentically used with Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions, for example, including in an inscription that's been found in Hezekiah's tunnel, which is dated back to 700 BC. And we'll see how it responds. Okay, what does it say? It says, yes, the Bat Creek Stones inscription includes a comma-like mark, which has been interpreted by some as a word divider. And yes, that's akin to those in ancient Paleo-Hebrew texts, such as the Siloam inscription in Hezekiah's tunnel. So basically, it meant everything I said was correct. And that some argue that this was unknown in the 1800s and suggests or shows the stone's authenticity, as Emmert wouldn't have any way to know it. It says, however, Mainford and Quast counter that the inscription closely matches the Masonic chart, but that mark is not in there. So, with additional marks, likely errors or embellishments by an inexpert forger. So it says, okay, yes, it does have this extra mark. Yes, this mark is found in a 700 BC authentic text. Yes, it's not in the Masonic inscription. But nevertheless, its inclusion there is just an accident or an error, even though it has been found to be actually authentic. So let's do a follow-up question of what are the odds of that? Okay, so here's the follow-up question to ask about the odds of that. So I say, you acknowledge that the comma-like mark that's on the Bat Creek stone is not in that Masonic book that was supposedly used by Emmert to copy. And yet this same kind of mark has been found in Hezekiah's tunnel. So it's potentially an authentic Paleo-Hebrew mark that's not in the Masonic book. but you still call it just an error. So I ask it, what are the odds that Emmert made an error like this that turned out to be a potentially authentic ancient Paleo-Hebrew mark? We'll see how it responds. It says, so the comma-like mark resembles word dividers that end at 700 BC inscription. It is absent from the Masonic book, so it's acknowledging everything I said in the question. Um, it says there are proponents that argue that this shows ancient origin. It still says, well, it still says its presence as an error is plausible. So now it's withdrawn itself to it's plausible that it's a forgery. Basically arguing luck. I asked it to give the odds. It's not giving the odds. It says it's plausible. Uh, it says that the Siloam inscription was discussed in biblical scholarship back to the 1880s. That could have been potentially accessible to Emmert. Emmert as a field assistant. There's no evidence of there. So Hezekiah's tunnel, I'm not sure exactly when it was found, but there is no evidence at all of Emmert having any access or knowledge of that kind of an inscription. But it's saying it's possible. And then it's possible that word dividers are known from other scripts. The odds of Emmert inadvertently including a mark mimicking it's not negligible. So it's refusing to give up, and it's saying that that still could have just been lucky. And then goes back to the brass bracelets and others. So again, what you see here is that uh, be warned, working with AI, you can't really trust it, especially on controversial issues, to find the truth. What you will get is it only repeats what it can pull from the mainstream scholarship that its algorithm will show it to stick to. So you do things like this, and it just kind of regurgitates and gets more ridiculous and more ridiculous. But what you see from this debate is Grok has essentially gotten back to where instead of saying at the beginning that uh, the Bat Creek Stone it's inauthentic, it basically has acknowledged each point, but is now basically to the point saying, well, still think it's possible. Could have been a forgery. Could have gotten lucky on the inscription. Emmert could have been a mad genius who was artificially weathering the stone to make it fool the microscopic petrography tests that come later and so forth. Could have stained the wood fragments to make them look older. It gets more ridiculous and more ridiculous as a forgery theory, but nevertheless that it's stuck with that because that's what it's pulling from the sources that it relies on. We've covered the other main topics with Grok. I want to ask about the motivation. So again, all of it comes back to the idea that John Emmert what had to have been the forger of the Bat Creek Stone. To do this, he would have had to have had knowledge of Hebrew, where he's adding marks that turn out to be authentic Paleo-Hebrew marks, even though there's no evidence of him knowing any Hebrew. Or and then also, having the inscriptions being weathered, although there's no evidence of him knowing how to do those kind of weathering techniques. Or you have the wood fragments, which are carbon dated. There's no evidence that he would know, think to stain the wood to match the color. I mean, all of it's ridiculous. The level of effort to go through would have been extensive, long planning, high levels of expertise. When realistically, if you look back at who Emmert was, there's no indication that he had any motivation or skills to do that. So I'll get to this question and see how Grok responds. So what I said is, your answers have primarily relied on Mainford and Quass, who believe that Emmert forged the Bat Creek Stone. Which from your answers above would have required Emmert to have knowledge of Hebrew texts, which there's no evidence he knew of, and to have artificially weathered the inscriptions, even though there's no evidence he knew of such weathering techniques or was a forger. But they argue Emmert never, and then I say, but Emmert never sought fame or fortune for finding the stone And his boss, Cyrus Thomas, was hostile to the idea of a Native American Hebrew connection, such that Emmert's finding of a stone with Hebrew writing would have jeopardized his job. So, in 200 words or less, isn't it true that there is no evidence that Emmert ever promoted the Bat Creek Stone as a Hebrew relic, or of any motivation by Emmert to forge it? Doesn't that point to its authenticity? Okay, I'll see how Grok responds. Okay, so it says just goes back to Mainford Aquas again that he forged it. It acknowledges there is no direct evidence that shows Emmert knew Hebrew. There's no evidence he knew weathering techniques, but the chart was accessible. That is true. So there was an 1870. So if he had gone to look for it, he could have potentially found it. There's no explanation for how he would do authentic additional marks. It acknowledges that yes, never promoted the stone as Hebrew. It's true that Emmert's reports didn't emphasize any Hebrew connections. It is true that his boss was skeptical of Native American Hebrew links. That suggests no fame motive. They propose that his goal was job security. Well, that's ridiculous. If his boss was hostile to the idea of a Native American Hebrew link, that his goal was to have greater job security by offending his boss. I mean, it's ridiculous. Maybe I'll do one follow-up question on that. No evidence confirms that he had any forging intent. They say the evidence overall supports forgery. It could have been subtle planting, blah, blah, blah. And I just want to do the follow-up question about the boss. So I ask it this follow-up question. So since Emmert's boss, Cyrus Thomas, was skeptical of Native American Hebrew connections, would Emmert finding a rock with Hebrew writing on it be consistent with a proposed goal of job security when finding something that your boss would think is a forgery instead jeopardize his job instead of giving him job security? And we'll see how Grog responds. Okay, so we read the response. So the argument that it was a secure for job security, it hinges on the idea that he just wanted to find a notable find. Um, Forging a stone with an inscription resembling Hebrew would be risky if he intended it to be seen as Hebrew. Given Thomas's skepticism, such a find could invite scrutiny and jeopardize his job if deemed fraudulent. Moreover, Mainford and Quas argue that his goal was to present a sensational but ambiguous artifact to bolster his productivity, not to explicitly claim Hebrew origins. The stone's vague inscription allowed flexibility. Thomas accepted it as Cherokee, avoiding immediate rejection. Okay, so they're claiming that he does the inscription not to be looked at as Hebrew now, but to be looked at as Cherokee. But they're saying that he copied it from a Masonic book with Hebrew. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so the job security assumes he aimed to impress with the finds, not necessarily to align with Thomas's theories. I'm going to go ahead and do one quick follow-up just to uh, challenge that thought. And also, we'll just do this quick follow-up. So, if Emmert didn't intend for it to be seen as Hebrew, why would he copy a Hebrew inscription to make it? In 100 words or less, I ask Grok, do you really think that makes sense? And we'll see how Grok responds. So Grok responds, well, again, it shows what this shows is that this artificial intelligence, it doesn't think for itself. It finds sources that it thinks that its algorithm tell it are reliable, and it just spins and twists those same sources over and over again. And so when you ask it, does it really make sense? It gets to a point where it doesn't answer that question. It doesn't think for itself. And instead, it keeps going back to what it considers its algorithm makes it think are the reliable sources. So it says, do you really think it makes sense for him to copy Hebrew if he didn't want it to be seen as Hebrew? It doesn't make any sense at all. And they say, and it just goes back and points to the source that it thinks are reliable with their main port in Quas. And they say, well, he copied it from this, not to claim Hebrew origins, and then presenting it as Cherokee. He didn't present it as Cherokee. He presented it as markings that he had never seen before. So again, sometimes AI just makes stuff up too, but it's probably relying on sources to think that. And then it says, well, risky. This aligns with Hemmert's subtle reporting and lack of Hebrew promotion. It still thinks the logic holds. So it doesn't really answer the question. It just says, well, he thinks that the logic still holds. Um, anyway, so that let me go ahead and stop share there. Okay, so I may do other debates with Grok on other Book of Mormon evidence things. Call this round one. As you can see, what you get with a debate with Grok is it's essentially like arguing with a collection of a personality-less mainstream scientist, because that's what it'll do. It'll only parrot what it finds, what its algorithms show as sort of the mainstream, and it'll just keep going back to that. So um, two final thoughts. One is, beware for yourself and for your children, grandchildren, in terms of relying on artificial intelligence to give you the truth of things, specifically on things that are controversial, or on things where maybe it's with our church and its beliefs, which are not consistent with or contrary to the mainstream, because Grok and other artificial intelligence will keep pushing back to the mainstream, and doesn't really think independently. Um, Even when you present the logic to it, it'll just keep reverting to, well, it's plausible, and relies on that. Um, so we'll do this. I'm thinking of doing additional ones. Let me know whether you like the format or not, and we'll see whether it's worth doing more. I look forward to your thoughts and comments. Thanks.